Great. So as people know, this is Diane Sayre, LaRouche independent candidate for U.S. Senate. And I've asked award-winning journalist Vanessa Beeley, who's currently in Syria, to just bring us up to date on the strategic situation there from her perspective. There's a great deal that Americans are not being told about the situation overall. And I think the war danger globally is only escalating, although I do have to say that in the last couple of days, the Chinese pulled off a major flank, which is the former leader of Taiwan, who's with the Kuomintang party, just went to mainland China to meet with Xi Jinping. They're agreeing to restart tourism. He's gone back now to Taiwan. He was accompanied by a whole delegation of young people to urge people to accept the idea of two systems, one country, and to not allow Taiwan to be pulled in a situation potentially like Ukraine, where they just get ground up in a proxy war run by the NATO allies against Russia. Now, the situation in what you could call the Middle East, or more correctly, I think Southwest Asia, is also really escalating after the Israeli strike on Iran at their consulate in Damascus. And I think there's much more. So let me just say that participation in talks with me, Diane Sayre, does not constitute endorsement of any political campaign. I may or may not agree with the views of everyone that I host, but I think there are certain urgent matters that need to be discussed and brought to people's attention. So, Vanessa, really glad to have you. And let me know if you want me to pull the map down whenever, but why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I mean, I also wanted to make clear that this attack, which was about 10 days ago, it was last Monday, which was carried out by Israel against basically the Iranian consulate building, which is part of the embassy complex in one of the busiest areas of Damascus, which is the capital city, of course, of Syria, in an area where at that time of day, at 5 p.m., there would have been hundreds, if not thousands, of civilians, because this was 5 p.m. just before iftar, so people during Ramadan, so people were literally going to buy food, to go home. It was packed, and although 7 Iranian military advisors were killed, General Zahedi, who was actually there on official government business. So this constitutes, therefore, a terror attack. Not only is it attacking effectively Iranian territory, it's violating the Vienna Convention, it's violating pretty much every single international law convention. But it also, on top of the 7 Iranian advisors who were killed, there were upwards of another 7 or 8 killed that were civilians or Syrian Arab Army guards that are usually posted around the embassies. 2 friends of mine were actually terribly injured in the bombing. Both of them are still in hospital, as far as I know, under critical care. One, her leg was completely shattered. It needs bone graft, skin graft, etc. So, you know, this was also an attack on civilians, a totally unwarranted attack on civilians. And as I said, a violation of international law that has been condemned by almost every single country in the world, except, of course, those who support Israel, namely the US, the UK, members of the EU, France, Germany, etc., who have steadfastly refused to actually condemn such an attack. But it's also important to note that this attack came at 5 p.m. In the early hours of the same day, there was another attack by Israel against a technology and development center, which is actually very close to me. And a few days before that, Israel again violated Syrian airspace. It entered via Jordan over the US illegal military base of Al Tanf on the border with Jordan, then flew at low altitude into the Syrian desert area, where they targeted eastern Aleppo at the same time that Al-Qaeda attacked western Aleppo. So this was an obvious sort of collaboration between the terrorist groups in northwest and Idlib that have been described as an asset of the US. And in an attempt to basically divert the air defense systems and allow Israel to target ammunition depots and military bases to the east of Aleppo. So this is part of an ongoing escalatory campaign by Israel to expand the war outside of Palestine, outside of Gaza, and into Syria, and now, of course, in direct violation with Iran, effectively attacking Iranian territory. So it's a very dangerous escalation.
I'm going to pull up the map because you're saying things, and I hate to say it, but I'm afraid many people just don't know where these countries are. So here is Syria, here is Iran, of course, here is Lebanon, Jordan. So if you could just describe that a bit again while people are watching, because it sounds to me like what you're saying, which would make complete sense from what I know, is you have a real coordination between the ISIS groups that we know the United States has been funding and supporting, as well as the British. I have to always say the British involved in this in a horrific way, but they just don't have as much power. So, but they're really good at geopolitical games. And Israel.
Yeah.
That sounds like what you're saying. So
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
And this has been something that has been ongoing since 2011. I mean, Israel has been very clear that it would prefer to have an extremist government in power to having President Assad in power, because Assad, one of the many reasons that, of course, this regime change war was started was that he wouldn't abandon Palestine or the resistance factions like Hezbollah and its alliance with Iran. But yeah, the fact is that Israel attacked, and I think when it attacked the Iranian embassy, it was attacking from the Golan Heights. You can see there, or rather the Golan territories, in the area that it has illegally annexed since 1967. That's a recognized fact by the UNGA. Various administrations in the US have tried to basically legitimize that annexation of Syrian territory, which, by the way, provides 30% of Israel's water supply, not to mention oil, of course. So again, resources come into play.
So you're saying there was activity targeting Aleppo, which is up here, at the same time approximately as or just prior to the attack on Damascus?
No, basically the attack on the Iranian embassy came last Monday. A few days before that, there was an incursion by Israeli warplanes. So if you go from Jordan almost to the border with Iraq, and then and there you've got the Al Tanf military base, which is on the border with Jordan. So they entered through, if you like, American-controlled airspace, then entered Syrian airspace into that central area below the word Syria. And from there, they launched missiles. I think it was around 60 missiles into Aleppo. And even before this, so a few days before this, they did the same thing. They entered over the airspace of Al Tanf, the illegal military US base, and they targeted the northeast, which is again occupied by the United States, that has control of oil resources and agricultural resources in that sector. And they targeted fundamentally the elements, the Syrian National Defense Forces, some of the PMU forces and Iranian forces that are there basically to secure that area from ISIS, which, as we've mentioned, is simply nothing more than another US proxy in Syria and also in Iraq. They're retraining ISIS in Iraq. And of course, if we want to make a general connection, then allegedly ISIS carried out the attack on the Crocus concert in Moscow, in west of Moscow. And apparently a week before that, or a few weeks before that attack, there were Ukrainian military that were flown into the northeast of Syria in a US cargo plane, where they had discussions with American military and the Kurdish Contras, or separatists, as I call them. Now, we know that from 2014, ISIS fighters from Syria were going into Ukraine, particularly Chechen fighters. We know in the northwest that Chechen fighters have basically been paid by Ukraine to carry out attacks against Russian military positions in the northwest of Syria. So in my view, we're starting to see a blurring of the lines between these conflicts, because we're starting to see how they're interconnecting in a war against Russia and Iran, with Syria very much as the kind of central hub for this war. Because even if Iran retaliates, and it has it's an entirely legitimate retaliation if it does retaliate. But of course, I don't believe that either the US or Israel are going to target Iran directly, because that means open escalation, open war, and we're in World War III. But of course, what they will do is to target potentially Iranian military again inside Syria. So Syria is always, if you like, the punch bag in the middle of this war expansion by Israel. And to a large degree, you know, I don't really believe the US or the Biden administration rhetoric that they are trying to de-escalate. They're making noises. We've had Britain, Germany, Australia calling the Iranian foreign minister, asking him to damp it down, but still not condemning the Israeli attack.
Right. No, and the foreign minister of Iran is coming to the to the US, to the UN on the 18th. I would be very concerned about his security over here, but also saying, you know, and they said it at the UN yesterday, if the UN Security Council, if there would have been action condemning these terrorist strikes, then the need to retaliate would have been obviated. But of course, now on this blurring of the lines, you know, the Washington Post, and I think another publication earlier, had done a whole expose on the MI6, CIA, and the Ukrainian intelligence agencies, because the way they explained it was that the US and UK were having a hard time recruiting spies inside Russia, or also getting into Russia. There's the language, everything else, but Ukrainians can be virtually indistinguishable from Russians. So if you really want to spy on Russia, you do it through Ukraine, which means that we are totally embedded with this, with the neo-Nazi groups. And I don't think there's really much difference between neo-Nazism and terrorism of the ISIS variety, or the frankly Nazi-like tactics being deployed by the IDF right now against the civilian population of Gaza. It seems like a real conglomeration of evil. Are there lines really between these groups and these policies?
No, not really, because to a large degree, Israel could be considered a proxy. You know, where Ukraine is a proxy that unfortunately, to its own detriment, is being used militarily against Russia. ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all the various sort of genetically modified terrorist groups that operate within Syria and within the region are proxies designed to carry out US, UK, EU agendas in the region, particularly in Syria at the moment. And the IDF or Israel itself, I mean, as I've said before, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. made it absolutely clear why Israel is so vital to what is described as US national security, because it provides surveillance, interference, military presence for the US inside the region, but most of all that it will prevent the rise of BRICS, it will prevent the rise of Russia, Iran, China in the region and the control of the commodities. So
Right.
it's very clear, you know, what Israel's purpose is
Right.
for
I
the
mean,
United States.
but it really is like King Canute trying to stop the waves from coming
Yeah,
in. I mean, the
exactly.
global south and the BRICS are about two-thirds or more of the world's population. They're certainly way more than 50% of the world's production, the world's raw material. You're not going to stop this, short of
Mm.
perhaps a nuclear war or some kind of horror. And I think that's really what makes it so dangerous. And I have to say, as an American, you know, John Quincy Adams, if he could jump out of his grave and grab some of these people, would be, you know,
Yeah.
bringing them back down, you know, throwing them down into hell or something. Because
Mm.
the whole point of the United States, when we had a revolution against the British, was to be a bulwark against this, that we were supposed to protect those nations that were trying to get out of poverty, that were trying to develop and be like a brother, you know, not going in there and smashing them over the head with a baseball bat about adopting our system. But, and then Henry and Matthew Carey, there's a beautiful book called Harmony of Interest by Henry Carey, who was an advisor to Lincoln, where he explains that actually you think that free trade works because you're lowering the standard of living, you're using people for slaves, and that everyone can therefore consume more because it's cheaper. And what he proves is that actually, the more you encourage a rising standard of living, the better off people are, and the more they are able to consume. So it's really in our interest. Our interest would be to see
Yeah.
everyone develop and to see peace and prosperity. So we're also really acting against our interest. And I think you see it here terribly. I don't know when you
Mm.
were last in the US, but you
Long
know,
time ago.
yeah, I've been a little taken aback by how the decline is so sensuous and so rapid. It's not like cooking a frog in where you slowly turn up the water. It's
Yeah.
been really abrupt,
Mm.
the infrastructure crumbling, and it's so blatant. People presume it's terrorism. It doesn't have to be terrorism, you know, when you don't build basic security, you know, buffers around the bottom of the bridge, like in Baltimore,
Yeah.
or you have pipes that are, most of our cities have underground pipes that are over a century old. When I lived in Washington, D.C. in the 1990s, we actually got a letter that
Mm.
said the pipes are so old that if we can't really treat the water properly, so if you're immune deficient, you shouldn't drink the tap water. That's the capital of the United States.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's no different in the UK, to be honest. You know, the societal decay and which is totally driven from the top, but it's very, very similar. National Health Service has been completely decimated. There's no middle class anymore. Really, that's been completely written out, really. Yeah, I mean, you can talk about it endlessly. To a large degree, that's one of the reasons that I moved here, because we have societal values here that have been completely eradicated in the West deliberately and
Right,
destroyed.
right, right. And that's, I think, part of the challenge to us, because I
Mm.
don't see a way out of, I don't know that this can be changed if we don't get the US to change its policy. I find it very hard to imagine how it works if the US doesn't dramatically change. But this cultural question, that's a really big challenge here. I
Mm.
actually think it's a great blessing that we have so many immigrants, first and second generation from other parts of the world, because that is a moderating, it means that many
Mm.
Americans, particularly in the metropolitan areas, know somebody from another part of the world, which therefore gives them a little bit of an insight that's much better than what you see from the government right
Yeah.
now. I think the
Mm.
polls are something like 70% of Americans don't think we should be arming Ukraine anymore, for example. Maybe it's 60% on Israel don't think we should be arming them anymore. The Congress feels like they can completely disregard that.
Yeah, completely. Well, I mean, the bombing of Yemen had
Right.
absolutely no mandate. And I mean, what has the US done now? Because since the attack on the Iranian embassy, the US has effectively been in panic mode because it's made incredible offers of diplomacy to Yemen, including recognition of the National Salvation Government, which is a coalition government of
Right.
38 of the political factions in Yemen, to remove Ansarullah from the terror list, and various other, to remove all foreign forces, which, by the way, is an admission that the US actually has foreign forces in Yemen, but we'll let that one
Wow.
sit.
Wow. Well, I
But
have,
Yemen's answer has been, until you stop the genocide in Gaza, we will continue with our legitimate action to blockade the Red Sea as a punitive action against genocide under the Genocide Convention. Iran has also said, if Israel is prepared to agree to a full, I don't like using the word ceasefire, but let's say a full demilitarization of Gaza, and assurances that it's not going to carry out the Rafah operation, which is going to be another massacre,
right.
then Iran will withhold retaliation. But there's been no response to this. So what
Right.
you're seeing is the resistance factions actually being very clear in their agenda, which is you have to stop
Right.
this genocide, stop supplying arms to the
Right.
very
That's
least.
so important because the line here, of course, is that Hamas has said every single Israeli has to be killed, which is not true, that they would never negotiate a two-state solution. That's not even true anymore.
Mm.
And the same thing what you're saying with Iran. So there could be peace. Now, tomorrow the Schiller Institute is holding this
Mm.
conference about the Oasis Plan, which was actually put forward by Lyndon LaRouche way back in
Yeah.
1975. And Henry Kissinger personally flew to Paris to prevent the diplomatic meetings that were going to occur. At that time, it was actually the Ba'ath Party of Iraq that was going to issue credit for building massive desalination facilities, greening the desert, creating a real economic powerhouse so you could have a peaceful, sovereign Palestine and next to Israel. And LaRouche was in dialogue with some of the peace faction in Israel, which largely have been sort of crushed or
Yeah,
terrorized,
exactly.
right? But so because if you again the map, this region is such a crucial. I'm just going to go back to it because look, if you think in terms of the great game, you're looking at an area which is sort of the crossroads between Asia,
Yeah.
Europe, Africa. This it could be the cradle of civilization, or it could be such
Mm.
an incredible crossroads of cultures and development. And if you think like the British, divide and conquer, don't have too many people, we want to come in and steal your raw materials. Well, you pick certain choke points where you
Yeah.
can get, I guess, the maximum bang for your buck. So if you disrupt a
Hmm.
crucial area, uh, but what we will be discussing is the program. There's some opposition because we're proposing nuclear power for desalination. Um, I think that's the most efficient, but okay, if they don't want nuclear power, they've got to have some kind of massive amount of energy. There's also a proposed irrigation canal, not a big shipping canal, not a replacement for the Suez Canal, but
Mm.
from the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea, which is 400 meters below sea level. So you could
Mm.
generate hydroelectric power if you want to do it that way. That's fine. Uh, and I think it kind of goes against the grain because so many people said, and they said it about Afghanistan too, well, you can't have an economic solution without a political solution. But I think, and Helga thinks that it actually works the other way, because unless people can see a hope for
Mm,
calmness, for security, for prosperity, then what is the incentive for a political solution? I
mm.
think it's very hard to impose a political solution on a war zone. Whereas if you said, well, here's this plan to green the desert, and here's what we're going to put into it, and here's how the credit's going to be generated. And in that context, could we come up with, a way, a political agreement? I think it's more likely to go that way. But I'd like your thoughts on this idea of the Oasis plan, and then also, where does this go next in a sense, if we don't do something like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's very difficult. It's like here, for example, living here, it's very hard for people to envisage any kind of hope because everything has been destroyed, decimated. A political solution, I don't really think it's for any external power or country to impose a political solution on any other country.
Mm-hmm.
I think there can be negotiations, but it's not up to us really. Different cultures need different governance.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't, democracy is something that I think has been so overused as a term to enable the US to basically carry out its regime changing agendas and its destabilization. And you're absolutely right to point out that this is British MO behind it all, also in particular the kind of the partitioning, the carving up of countries, which basically create sectarian divisions for the future. That, of course, is what they were going to do to Yemen before the war kicked off in March 2015, isolating Ansarullah from the other statelets that they were intending to create. So this is what they always tried to do, as they did in former Yugoslavia. So I think political solutions I worry about a bit anyway, because I think really in the West we've done enough interfering in the political
Yeah.
affairs of other countries.
In a way, you say, can you just stand back and get out of the way, but allow
Yeah,
good? We have to create a
yeah,
space of
absolutely.
non-interference, and that's why this whole question of the mess, because after, frankly, the Minsk Accords and what was
Oh,
exposed, right, where
yeah,
Hollande and Merkel, oh no,
exactly.
we never meant to have peace, we just wanted to train the army. Well, once you've said that,
And
why should
Merkel said the
yes,
same thing, Angela
exactly.
Merkel. So
So
yeah,
why would anybody ever enter into or trust you as a broker? And that's why I'm saying, in part, and I think there has to be a kind of revolution in the
mm,
United States, like a spiritual cleansing, where we say, well,
yeah,
at least we're going to get Assange out of jail, or at least we're going to get the files on the Kennedy assassination, or at least we're going to find out what really happened on 9/11. There has to be some
mm,
act of goodwill from the United States where there's any indication that this mess of intelligence agencies, which are really not loyal to any country, and it's financial too, right? It's the
yeah.
billionaires and the intelligence agencies and the military. We have to demonstrate that there's reason to believe that our government has been liberated from this
I mean,
mess.
yeah, I think for me, um, the most important thing is to end US occupation anywhere in the world.
Mm-hmm.
The US has been asked to leave Iraq. It hasn't left Iraq. And
Right.
very, very similar to what it did in
And I
Syria.
don't believe we were invited to Syria.
No, not really.
Right.
No, no, actually the same in Iraq, because of course the reason for expanding the US military footprint in Iraq was because they created this legend of Zarqawi, the Al-Qaeda leader, that basically enabled them, just as ISIS has enabled them, to put military bases inside Syria. But the difference is in Iraq, to some extent, there was agreement to have the military bases, but they have been asked to leave for, I think, at least a few years now. And they haven't reduced. In fact, they've increased to a large degree their military footprint. They're retraining ISIS in various areas of Iraq that are currently carrying out attacks on electricity, infrastructure, etc. In Syria, the reason we're on our knees here is because the US is occupying our oil resources and our agricultural resources in the northeast, and by proxy in the northwest, and to a large degree in the south. So that entire eastern corridor is effectively blockaded by the US. They're trying to take control of Al-Bukamal, which is the last remaining open border with Iraq and to Iran, which Iran uses Syria. So I think for me, yes, you know, that the entire idea is fantastic. But I think until that occupation is gone, there can't be direct dialogue with the political institutions in those countries, because you now have, for example, the anti-normalization with Assad Act under the Biden administration, which is going to be a complete blockade on that kind of dialogue. I mean, yeah, I would love to see America become a force for growth, development, and at least repair some of the sort of decimation of development. I mean, look at Libya. Libya was one of the most progressive countries.
And by the way, you know, Columbia University is bringing in these destroyers. I was joking that they're just missing the third witch of Lady Macbeth, because Hillary Clinton and now Victoria Nuland are both on the faculty at Columbia University. So I don't know if it's going to be Samantha Power or Nikki Haley or who's going to be coming on to
God.
Yeah, it's, you know, we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot to do. I do think there's hope. I have actually been inspired by all these young people in the streets because of what's happening in Gaza. The uncommitted vote is surely having an impact. It caused Chuck Schumer, who is just a sleazy opportunist, to go before the Senate and say that Netanyahu was destroying the security of Israel. We know it's not merely Netanyahu. He's a crazed figurehead that's, you know, convenient, but they're feeling forced to do to make some noises, as you're saying. The next thing is to force the action. And on the occupation, that's great, because I don't think virtually any American thinks we should have troops on the ground in Syria or Iraq. I mean, what's the purpose of being in a place where your only deployment is defending yourself from being killed because people don't want you there? There's no purpose whatsoever except for some kind of criminal intent. And we're putting people in harm's way. And as you know, in the United States, right now to this day, since 9/11, we have an average of 20 soldier suicides per day. 20 per day.
Which is insane.
Which shows you that people have a conscience, right? They find it unbearable what they're being asked to do. We saw the most, you know, stark form of that with Aaron Bushnell. But so I think something's going to give. We cannot possibly continue in this direction. What that looks like, I don't know.
Is there any opportunity in the States to actually get a direct line to the military? Because what I found in Europe, particularly in France, for example, myself and a couple of colleagues of mine who are on very much on the same track, we were actually invited to speak at the Saint-Cyr Military Academy, which is an international, one of virtually like the Sandhurst in Europe, you know. And I was able to speak directly with American cadets, Polish cadets, French cadets. And I was actually pleasantly surprised. I mean, the American cadets were actually telling me, well, we know that the chemical weapon attacks in Syria are false flags. We knew that from the beginning. And these are, you know, these are young future soldiers. I always thought that that is a way in, because in France, for example, the military or the intellectuals within the military were very much squeezed out of decision making, and yet, in a sense, they are the ones that are going to be sent to die in these various unnecessary wars and conflicts that are not of their making.
Right.
You
Well, you're
know,
right. That's a very interesting question. We should look into it. I think we should probably wrap up. I really want to
yeah,
thank you for your
no
time.
problem.
I'm sorry it's not possible for you to be with us tomorrow. I can say, and you know, that we ended up getting some very high
Yeah,
level diplomatic representation, which I think is excellent, because this is exactly the kind of dialogue that is so needed right now.
yeah.
And I hope that we will be talking again soon, and it will be much happier circumstances.
I hope so. I hope so. There'll be a link to that conference, won't there?
Yes, at
Yeah, cool.
schillerinstitute.com.
Okay.
Yes,
All right.
great.
Good
Thank you
luck with
so
that,
much.
Diane. Take care.
You too.
Bye.